Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly profound and utterly ordinary world of kangaroos, those awkward hoppers who've mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing spectacular while somehow creating a life worth living. While nature documentaries make them look majestic, the truth is being a kangaroo is gloriously mundane, eating grass, hopping around, and perfecting the ancient art of strategic napping. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't so much enter the world as tumble into it, like someone falling out of a hammock they didn't know they were sleeping in. The pouch, your first apartment, really has been getting cramped for weeks, and today gravity finally wins the argument you've been having with your mother's patient tolerance. The transition from warm, enclosed darkness to the shocking brightness of the Australian morning is roughly equivalent to being launched from a comfortable cave into the surface of the Sunday. Your first breath of outside air carries information your tiny brain isn't quite ready to process. The dry heat that tastes like dust and distant rain, the sharp scent of eucalyptus leaves baking in relentless sunshine, and something else, something vast and empty and utterly indifferent to your recent arrival. The Australian outback greets you with all the enthusiasm of a bouncer checking IDs, hot, skeptical, and vaguely threatening. The red dirt stretches endlessly in every direction, punctuated by scrubby bushes that look like they've given up on life but are too stubborn to die. It's a landscape that seems designed by someone who heard minimalist described once, but misunderstood the assignment entirely. Your mother stands nearby, chewing methodically on something that might charitably be called grass, watching you with the expression of someone who's just realized they've forgotten to cancel a subscription they never wanted in the first place. Her jaw moves in a steady rhythm that suggests she's either deeply contemplative or working through some complex mathematical problem involving the nutritional value of vegetation that appears to have the texture of old leather. The sun hangs overhead like a cosmic heat lamp set to medium roast, and you blink against it, your dark eyes adjusting to a world that's suddenly, overwhelmingly three-dimensional. After months of experiencing life as a series of muffled sounds and gentle movements, the sheer amount of sensory input is almost insulting. Colors exist in varieties you didn't know were possible, not just the red of the earth, but dozens of different reds, each with its own subtle character and apparent opinion about how dirt should properly behave. Everything smells like dust and eucalyptus, and that particular brand of nowhere that only the outback can provide. It's not an unpleasant smell, exactly, but it carries with it the unmistakable message that this is a place where comfort is negotiable and survival is a daily discussion between you and an environment that remains fundamentally unconvinced of your right to exist. The silence is perhaps the most shocking element of your new reality. Not the absence of sound, the outback has its own soundtrack of insects and distant bird calls, and the subtle whisper of wind moving through dry grass, but the complete absence of the steady, reassuring heartbeat that has been the background music of your entire existence until this moment. You're suddenly, acutely aware that you are now responsible for keeping your own heart beating, a responsibility that seems both obvious and terrifying. Your first attempts at movement produce results that could generously be described as experimental. Your limbs, which seemed perfectly adequate for the limited space requirements of pouch life, appear to have been designed by a committee that never quite agreed on what they were supposed to accomplish. Your hind legs, in particular, seem disproportionately large and possessed of their own agenda, while your front paws dangle with the helpless quality of something that's just remembered it has a job to do but can't quite recall what that job might be. The other members of your mob, your extended family, neighbors, and future critics, observe your debut performance with the kind of polite interest usually reserved for community theatre productions. They're close enough to intervene if something goes dramatically wrong, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about any association with your current struggles with basic motor functions. A slight breeze stirs the air, carrying with it the scent of more distant places, water perhaps, or different kinds of vegetation, or possibly just the general smell of somewhere else. For the first time in your brief existence, you experience something that might be called wanderlust, though it's immediately tempered by the practical reality that you haven't yet mastered the basic skill of standing upright without falling over. Your mother finishes her current mouthful of whatever she's been working on and turns her attention to you with the kind of focused interest that suggests a lesson is about to begin. It's not a formal education. Kangaroos don't go in for classroom instruction, but rather the beginning of a long, practical apprenticeship in the art of being alive in a place that's beautiful, harsh, and utterly unimpressed by good intentions. Your early days are a masterclass in controlled failure. Walking, or rather, the peculiar art of hopping, proves more challenging than it looks, which is saying something, since it already looks like a form of locomotion invented by someone who'd heard efficient movement described, but had never actually seen it demonstrated. You spend considerable time practicing the complex choreography of coordinating your massive hind legs with your decidedly less impressive front paws, often resulting in what can only be described as interpretive tumbling. Each attempt at forward motion becomes an elaborate dance between intention and physics, with physics winning most of the rounds in ways that would be comical if they weren't happening to you. The mechanics of hopping, you discover, involve a precise timing that seems to require the kind of coordination usually found in professional athletes or very talented insects. Your hind legs need to compress and release in perfect synchronization. Your front paws must somehow contribute to balance without getting in the way, and your tail, a body part you're still not entirely convinced belongs to you, apparently serves as some kind of biological rudder that you're supposed to operate instinctively. The other Joeys in your loose mob watch these performances with the kind of patient interest usually reserved for watching paint dry or waiting for seasonal weather changes. Occasionally, one of them will demonstrate proper technique with the casual superiority of someone who figured it out last week and has already moved on to more advanced concerns like which patches of grass taste least like disappointment. Their demonstrations are both helpful and mildly insulting. With apparently effortless grace, they execute perfect hops, smooth, efficient, landing exactly where they intended, while you continue to achieve results that suggest you're engaged in some kind of experimental performance art involving the creative reinterpretation of basic physics. You begin to suspect that kangaroo society operates on a strict hierarchy based primarily on who can hop without looking like they're being attacked by invisible bees. This is discouraging, since your current technique falls squarely into the definitely under attack by something supernatural category. Your mother continues her endless cycle of eating, chewing, and gazing into the middle distance with the philosophical resignation of someone who's seen 17 seasons come and go, each bringing its own collection of small dramas and predictable disappointments. She offers guidance in the form of occasional gentle nudges and the kind of meaningful looks that somehow convey entire dissertations on proper grass selection, the importance of staying hydrated, and the subtle art of recognizing which shadows provide actual protection versus which ones are just decorative. Her teaching method appears to be based on the principle that you'll figure things out faster if you're allowed to make your own mistakes, with intervention reserved for situations that might result in permanent damage or public embarrassment for the family. It's an approach that requires considerable faith in your ability to learn from experience, though the evidence for this faith is still being collected. The landscape becomes your classroom in ways you hadn't anticipated. Each rock, bush, and patch of bare ground offers its own lessons in the practical application of kangaroo life skills. You learn which bushes bite back literally, in some cases, as certain plants have evolved defensive strategies that seem specifically designed to discourage casual browsing by inexperienced herbivores. You discover that rocks, while appearing uniformly hard and uncomfortable, actually exist in a surprising variety of comfort levels. Some provide excellent support for afternoon naps, their sun-warmed surfaces maintaining just the right temperature for relaxation. Others seem designed by sadists, with surfaces that manage to be simultaneously too hot, too cold, and precisely the wrong shape for any conceivable resting position. The identification of proper shade becomes a critical survival skill that involves understanding the subtle difference between shadow that will keep you cool and comfortable and shadow that belongs to something with more teeth than you, which is currently taking a nap but might wake up cranky. This distinction proves more nuanced than you initially expected, requiring the development of a sophisticated understanding of scent markers, sound patterns, and the general atmospheric quality that distinguishes safe spaces from potential danger zones. Water sources present their own educational opportunities. The quality of water, you learn, varies significantly depending on its source, age, and what various creatures have been doing in or near it recently. Fresh rainwater collected in natural rock basins tastes clean and satisfying. Water that's been sitting in the sun for several days acquires a flavor profile that suggests it has opinions about its current situation. And water that shows signs of heavy traffic from the local wildlife community carries information about ecosystem health that your developing palate is gradually learning to interpret. Food selection emerges as perhaps the most complex skill you'll need to master. Not all grass is created equal, a lesson that comes as something of a shock, since grass had previously seemed like a fairly straightforward concept. Some varieties provide excellent nutrition and pleasant flavor, growing in convenient locations that don't require dangerous travel or territorial negotiations. Others appear to exist primarily to test your commitment to the herbivore lifestyle, offering nutritional value that barely justifies the effort required to chew them. Your developing sense of taste begins to distinguish between grasses that taste like actual food, grasses that taste like punishment for unknown crimes, and grasses that seem to be conducting some kind of chemical warfare against creatures presumptuous enough to consider them edible. The learning process involves a certain amount of trial and error, with error generally involving unpleasant digestive consequences that serve as effective memory aids for future decision-making. The social dynamics of mob life reveal themselves gradually through observation and occasional direct instruction from older, more experienced kangaroos who've achieved the kind of casual competence you're beginning to think might be mythical. There are subtle hierarchies based on age, size, and hopping ability, but also more complex social arrangements involving family relationships, territorial agreements, and what appears to be an ongoing community discussion about the best strategies for dealing with various environmental challenges. By your third week, you've mastered the basics of not falling over every time you attempt forward motion, though style points remain elusive, and the consensus among your peer group seems to be that your technique still falls somewhere between enthusiastic amateur and ongoing natural disaster. Your hops have evolved from panicked flailing to enthusiastic but imprecise, and you're beginning to understand why your species chose this particular method of locomotion in the first place. It's efficient, once you get the hang of it, though you suspect the first kangaroo to try it was probably just trying to avoid stepping on something sharp and accidentally discovered a revolutionary approach to getting from one place to another. The biomechanics of hopping begin to make sense in the way that complex machinery does once you understand its basic principles. Your hind legs function like powerful springs, storing and releasing energy with each jump. Your tail acts as a counterbalance and steering mechanism, while your front paws serve primarily to make you look slightly less ridiculous while airborne. The coordination required is considerable, but your body seems to be adapting to the demands with the kind of unconscious competence that suggests evolution knew what it was doing, even if the results still look somewhat improbable. The mob's daily routine becomes your routine, with the inevitability of sunrise. Wake up at dawn, not from enthusiasm, but because sleeping past sunrise in the outback requires the kind of dedication to unconsciousness that's difficult to maintain in direct sunlight. Eat things, move to where different things grow, eat those, find shade, contemplate existence, repeat. It's a life that would bore a Buddhist monk, but there's something oddly satisfying about the rhythm of it, like discovering that you enjoy music with a very slow tempo and very few notes. Your world consists of roughly 3 square kilometers of scrubland, each section offering its own subtle variations in dust, color, bush arrangement, and the quality of shadows available during different times of day. What initially seemed like a monotonous landscape reveals increasing complexity as your understanding deepens. The red dirt comes in dozens of shades, each indicating different soil composition, drainage patterns, and suitability for various types of plant growth. The vegetation demonstrates a surprising variety of survival strategies, from plants that store water in thick, waxy leaves to others that seem to exist in a state of perpetual dormancy, waiting for exactly the right combination of temperature and moisture to briefly burst into life. Some bushes produce berries at specific times of year, others offer the kind of leaves that make excellent emergency snacks, and a few appear to exist primarily to provide convenient scratching posts for creatures with itchy backs. You begin to notice the other residents of your neighborhood with the growing awareness that you're part of a complex community of creatures, each pursuing their own survival strategies with varying degrees of success and dignity. The occasional echidna wanders by like a living pine cone with an agenda, following some mysterious internal compass toward destinations that remain unclear but are apparently very important. These creatures move with the focused determination of someone late for an appointment they can't reschedule, barely acknowledging the kangaroo community as they pass through on their way to whatever echidnas consider urgent business. Lizards inhabit the area in numbers that suggest they've found the local real estate market very much to their liking. They seem to exist primarily to judge your hopping technique from strategic positions on sun-warmed rocks, offering silent commentary that you're fairly certain is unflattering. Their ability to remain perfectly motionless for extended periods gives them an unsettling quality, as if they're gathering intelligence for some purpose that hasn't been disclosed to the mammalian residents of the area. Birds appear to have nothing better to do than provide unwanted commentary on your daily activities. They perch in convenient locations and maintain a running dialogue about your progress, your technique, and apparently your general fitness for survival in their neighborhood. Their observations are delivered in a variety of calls that range from what sounds like encouragement to what definitely sounds like criticism, though the specific meanings remain unclear to your still developing understanding of interspecies communication. The weather patterns begin to make sense as more than just random variations in comfort level. Morning brings cool temperatures that make extended activity possible, along with a quality of light that makes everything look slightly more optimistic than it will later in the day. The heat builds gradually through the late morning and early afternoon, eventually reaching levels that make any kind of movement seem like poor decision-making, and staying in shaded areas becomes not just preferred, but mandatory for anyone with sense. Evenings offer relief and a second period of activity, though the approaching darkness brings its own set of considerations. Night predators operate according to different schedules and strategies than daytime threats, requiring awareness of shadows, sounds, and scents that might indicate the presence of creatures who consider kangaroos an acceptable dinner option. Your understanding of territorial boundaries develops through a combination of observation and occasional direct instruction from adults who've grown tired of watching you wander into areas where you don't belong. These boundaries aren't marked with visible signs, but rather with scent markers, well-worn paths, and the kind of subtle environmental cues that require experience to interpret correctly. Some areas are clearly neutral groundwater sources during drought periods, certain grazing areas that provide food for multiple species, and travel corridors that everyone seems to use without claiming permanent ownership. Other locations come with invisible "do not enter" signs that become apparent only when you've accidentally violated them and find yourself face to face with a resident who's not interested in discussing property rights diplomatically. The development of your own territorial instincts surprises you with its gradual intensity. Certain spots begin to feel like yours, in ways that you can't entirely explain: a favorite resting place beneath a particular bush, a section of grazing land that provides especially good grass, a view that offers excellent surveillance of your immediate surroundings. These preferences start as casual choices but gradually solidify into something approaching genuine attachment, as if the landscape is slowly becoming part of your identity rather than just your environment. Your first genuine crisis arrives in the form of a dingo, a scraggly, opportunistic creature that looks like it's been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions, then left out in the weather until it developed a permanent attitude problem about the unfairness of existence. It appears one morning while you're practicing your hopping technique near the edge of the mob's comfort zone, probably drawn by the sound of your less than graceful landings, which have been providing a steady acoustic advertisement of your location, skill level, and general availability as a potential meal option for anyone in the market for that sort of thing. The dingo's approach is casual in the way that predators have perfected over millions of years of evolution, not rushing, not obviously threatening, just gradually reducing the distance between itself and you while maintaining the kind of relaxed demeanor that suggests this is all a pleasant coincidence and definitely not a carefully calculated hunting strategy. You notice the dingo at roughly the same moment it decides you've noticed it, leading to one of those awkward social situations where both parties are suddenly aware that their previous assumptions about the nature of the encounter were probably incorrect. The dingo regards you with the kind of calculating interest that real estate developers reserve for prime beachfront property that's currently occupied by people who don't realize they're about to become former residents. You, in turn, regard the dingo with the dawning realization that you've wandered into what might generously be called a learning opportunity, though the specific lessons involved appear to be more advanced than anything you've covered in your brief educational career to date. The curriculum for this particular course seems to include modules on rapid decision-making, advanced cardiovascular exercise, and the practical application of all those hopping techniques you've been practicing for reasons that suddenly seem much more urgent. The distance between you and the dingo represents a complex mathematical problem involving relative speed, terrain advantages, and the probability that your still developing hopping skills will prove adequate for the immediate challenges of remaining uneaten. The dingo appears to be performing similar calculations, though with the benefit of considerably more experience in this type of situation. What follows is your first real test of kangaroo reflexes, though calling it a chase would be generous to both participants. It's more like an extended game of keep-away, with you as the unwilling ball and the dingo as an increasingly frustrated player who's beginning to suspect that the rules of this particular game are more complicated than initially advertised. Your hops, still more enthusiastic than elegant, carry you in roughly the right direction away from the sharp-toothed problem. Though your trajectory resembles that of a stone skipping on water, if the stone had never seen water before and was operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about the basic principles of physics and momentum. The terrain, which you've been thinking of as your familiar practice area, suddenly reveals itself to be a complex obstacle course, designed by someone with a sadistic sense of humor and an advanced degree in making simple things unnecessarily difficult. Rocks that seemed perfectly positioned for convenient rest stops now appear to be located exactly where they'll interfere with your hopping rhythm. Bushes that provided pleasant shade and wind protection transform into navigation hazards that require split-second decisions about whether to hop over, around, or through them. The dingo's pursuit strategy appears to be based on the principle of persistent pressure rather than dramatic speed, maintaining a steady pace that suggests confidence in the eventual outcome while conserving energy for the sustained effort that this type of hunting apparently requires. It's not the explosive, movie-style chase you might have expected, but rather a methodical demonstration of the advantages that come with experience, patience, and a clear understanding of your own capabilities relative to those of your intended meal. Your initial panic gives way to a kind of focused determination as your body begins to operate according to instincts you didn't know you possessed. Your hopping becomes less conscious and more automatic, as if some deeper part of your kangaroo brain has taken over the controls and is applying lessons learned by thousands of generations of ancestors who faced similar challenges and somehow managed to survive long enough to contribute to your genetic inheritance. The chase develops its own rhythm as you begin to understand the terrain advantages available to someone with your particular combination of size, speed, and maneuverability. Tight spaces between rocks favor your smaller stature, while your developing hopping skills allow you to navigate uneven ground more effectively than the dingo's four-legged approach, which seems optimized for open areas rather than obstacle courses. Minutes pass with the kind of subjective time distortion that accompanies genuinely stressful situations, each second stretching into what feels like extended periods of hyper-awareness, while simultaneously the entire encounter seems to be happening faster than your conscious mind can process. You become acutely aware of your heart rate, your breathing, the sound of your feet hitting the ground, and the gradually increasing distance between you and the persistent predator behind you. The dingo's determination begins to show signs of wavering as the easy meal it anticipated transforms into a cardiovascular workout that's requiring more effort than the potential rewards seem to justify. Its pace slows slightly, and its breathing becomes more labored, suggesting that the cost-benefit analysis of this particular hunting attempt is shifting in your favor. Your confidence grows with each successful hop that maintains or increases your lead. The movements that seemed so difficult and uncertain during practice sessions now feel natural and efficient, as if your body has finally figured out what all this hopping equipment is actually for. You begin to understand, in a visceral way that no amount of observation could have taught you, why evolution selected this particular approach to kangaroo locomotion. The encounter reaches its conclusion with the kind of anticlimactic resolution that characterizes most real-life dramas. The dingo, apparently deciding that you're more trouble than you're worth, gradually reduces its pursuit intensity and eventually wanders off to find something that won't require this much cardiovascular effort. There's no dramatic confrontation, No final sprint to safety, just the gradual realization that the immediate threat has decided to become someone else's problem. You return to the mob with your first real story to tell, though your audience seems less impressed than you'd hoped. The older kangaroos receive your breathless account of survival and narrow escape with the kind of polite interest usually reserved for stories about mildly interesting weather patterns. Your peer group shows more enthusiasm, but it's tempered by the knowledge that similar encounters are likely to be regular features of their own futures, making your experience less unique than you'd initially assumed. The incident leaves you with a new understanding of your place in the ecosystem, not quite as vulnerable as you'd feared, but definitely not as secure as you'd hoped. You've passed your first real test of survival skills, but the experience has also made clear that many more such tests await, each requiring its own combination of skill, luck, and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from surviving enough dangerous situations to recognize the patterns they tend to follow. Adolescence hits you like a growth spurt wrapped in confusion and delivered by hormones with questionable timing and a complete disregard for your previously stable sense of self. Your legs, already disproportionately large in that charming way that suggested you might eventually grow into them, decide to become even more so, giving you the appearance of someone wearing stilts they haven't quite figured out yet and aren't entirely sure they want to master. Your coordination, just beginning to resemble actual skill after months of dedicated practice and only occasional faceplants, abandons you entirely with the kind of spectacular betrayal usually reserved for politicians during election season. Movements that had become automatic suddenly require conscious thought, and conscious thought proves to be a poor substitute for the unconscious competence you'd only recently achieved. The transformation affects every aspect of your daily routine. Hopping, your primary method of transportation and source of growing confidence, becomes an adventure in applied physics that frequently ends with results that violate several basic principles of dignity. Your landing calculations, previously reliable enough for basic navigation, now operate according to some new mathematical system that appears to have been developed by someone with a grudge against predictability. Your voice, which had settled into a comfortable range of grunts, calls, and other socially acceptable kangaroo communications, decides to embark on its own journey of self-discovery. It cracks at inappropriate moments, produces sounds you didn't know you were capable of making, and occasionally abandons you entirely during what should be routine social interactions, leaving you standing there opening and closing your mouth like a fish that's suddenly realized it's not in water anymore. The other young kangaroos in your area are experiencing similar transformations, turning your once predictable social group into a collection of awkward, oversized creatures who bump into each other with alarming frequency and increasing embarrassment. What used to be casual gatherings around water sources or shaded resting areas now resemble carefully choreographed disasters, with everyone trying to maintain the appearance of coordination while secretly wondering if they'll ever feel competent again. Conversations become exercises in pretending you meant to hop in that particular direction, even when that direction leads directly into a thorny bush that you could have easily avoided if your depth perception hadn't suddenly developed its own creative interpretation of distance and spatial relationships. The art of casual socializing, never your strongest skill, becomes even more challenging when every physical movement carries the potential for public humiliation. Romance enters your life in the form of vague, confusing urges and an increased interest in the way certain other kangaroos smell, not the familiar, reassuring scents you've learned to associate with safety and community, but something else entirely. Something that makes your newly unreliable coordination even worse and introduces thoughts that seem to arrive from outside your normal thinking patterns, as if your brain has been invaded by a committee of advisors whose qualifications and motives remain unclear. This leads to a series of what can only be described as practice courtship attempts, most of which end with everyone involved looking mildly embarrassed and finding urgent reasons to be somewhere else. Your understanding of appropriate social behavior, already strained by the general chaos of adolescent development, proves completely inadequate for navigating the complex dynamics of romantic interest. The protocols for expressing attraction, you discover, were apparently covered in a class you missed, leaving you to improvise based on incomplete information and instincts that seem designed more for comedy than actual relationship success. Your attempts at impressive displays of hopping prowess frequently result in demonstrations of creative failure that serve primarily to advertise your current lack of coordination to exactly the audience you'd most prefer to impress. You discover that teenage kangaroo social dynamics operate on the same principles as most adolescent societies. Everyone is equally confused, but no one wants to admit it, leading to elaborate performances of confidence that fool absolutely no one, but somehow must be maintained for reasons that no one can adequately explain. Status becomes determined by increasingly ridiculous displays of hopping prowess, leading to competitions that would make extreme sports enthusiasts nervous, and insurance companies refuse coverage. These contests develop their own elaborate rules and traditions, none of which are written down or explicitly discussed, but all of which carry serious social consequences for violations or inadequate performances. Success requires not just physical skill, which most participants lack, but also the kind of confident presentation that can make even spectacular failures look intentional, or at least amusing rather than pathetic. The landscape around you begins to feel smaller, more familiar, but also somehow more complex, as if each rock and bush has developed its own personality and set of expectations about how it should be approached and utilized. Every location now carries associations and memories that transform neutral terrain into an emotional geography that affects your mood and behavior in ways you're still learning to understand. There's the spot where you first successfully landed a particularly ambitious jump, now permanently associated with a brief moment of genuine confidence that you occasionally revisit when your current coordination problems become too discouraging. The clearing where you had your first real conversation with another Joey about topics more substantial than grass quality or weather patterns, marking your introduction to the possibility that social interactions could involve actual exchange of ideas rather than just parallel activities. And there's the memorable bush where you learned that some plants fight back harder than others, providing a lesson in the importance of research and preparation that you've applied to numerous situations since, though apparently not to the current challenges of adolescent social navigation, which seem to require skills that no amount of cautious investigation can provide. Your territory, previously defined primarily by practical considerations like food availability and shelter quality, begins to include emotional significance and social meaning. Certain areas become associated with successful interactions, others with embarrassing failures, and some with the kind of confusing encounters that resist easy categorization, but somehow feel important enough to remember and occasionally revisit when you're trying to figure out what you might have learned from them. Conflict, you discover, is an inevitable part of kangaroo life, though it often arrives wearing the costume of comedy and speaking lines that sound like they were written by someone who'd heard about dramatic confrontation, but had never actually witnessed one in person. Your first real confrontation happens over a particularly appealing patch of grass, tender, green, and apparently worth defending according to some ancient kangaroo code you weren't aware existed, but which everyone else seems to have memorized, complete with footnotes and commentary about proper implementation procedures. The disputed territory in question consists of maybe 3 square meters of vegetation that, while admittedly superior to the surrounding forage options, hardly seems worth the kind of passionate defense that's apparently about to be mounted. The grass is indeed greener, more tender, and possessed of that perfect texture that makes eating feel less like work and more like actual pleasure, but the abundance of similar patches within easy hopping distance makes the intensity of the approaching conflict seem somewhat disproportionate to the stakes involved. The challenger is another young male, roughly your size, but with the kind of confidence that suggests he's never met a problem he couldn't hop away from, or alternatively, that he's never encountered a problem serious enough to require hopping away from in the first place. His approach combines casual assertiveness with the sort of relaxed territorial assumption that indicates either extensive experience with successful conflicts or a complete lack of experience with unsuccessful ones. He positions himself near the disputed grass with the air of someone taking possession of property that has always belonged to him but which has been temporarily misplaced due to administrative oversight. His body language suggests that your presence in the area represents a minor inconvenience that can be resolved through brief but decisive action, followed by a return to the serious business of eating premium grass, without interference from creatures who don't understand proper territorial protocols. What follows is your introduction to kangaroo boxing, a sport that combines the grace of ballet with the strategic thinking of rock, paper, scissors, and the practical effectiveness of a debate conducted entirely through interpretive dance. The rules, such as they are, seem to have been developed by a committee that couldn't agree on whether they were designing a combat system or an elaborate ritual for community entertainment. The preliminary phase involves a considerable amount of sizing each other up, circling, and engaging in what can only be described as aggressive posturing, standing tall, making yourself look as large and intimidating as possible, and exchanging the kind of meaningful stares that suggest each participant is trying to convince the other that they know secrets about fighting that make this confrontation completely unnecessary. This psychological warfare continues longer than seems strictly necessary, with both parties apparently hoping that sufficient displays of confidence and physical readiness will convince someone to withdraw without the need for actual physical contact. It's a strategy that has obvious advantages, since actual fighting involves risks that posturing avoids, but it requires a level of sustained dramatic intensity that becomes difficult to maintain when your opponent shows no signs of being appropriately intimidated. The actual fight, when it finally begins, resembles a slow-motion dance performed by participants who've forgotten the choreography but are determined to complete the performance anyway. There's a lot of standing up on hind legs, balancing precariously in positions that seem designed more for imposing visual impact than practical combat effectiveness, and taking turns swatting at each other with front paws that seem designed more for dramatic gestures than actual harm infliction. The technique appears to emphasize form over function, with points apparently awarded for style and creativity rather than actual damage dealt or strategic advantage gained. Occasionally, someone attempts a kick with their powerful hind legs, usually resulting in both parties losing their balance and having to start over from neutral positions, like fencers who've forgotten which end of the sword is supposed to point toward their opponent. The combat develops its own rhythm, with each exchange followed by a brief pause for reassessment, repositioning, and apparently some consideration of whether this is really the best use of everyone's time and energy. The intensity fluctuates between moments of genuine engagement and periods where both participants seem to be going through the motions while privately wondering how this situation escalated to actual physical confrontation over grass. That, viewed objectively, probably isn't worth this much effort. Your fighting technique, such as it is, relies heavily on enthusiasm and improvisation, since your education in combat arts consisted primarily of watching other kangaroos engage in similar contests and trying to extrapolate general principles from limited observations. Your strategy combines defensive caution with occasional bursts of aggressive optimism, producing results that are unpredictable enough to keep your opponent guessing, but not necessarily effective enough to provide decisive advantage. The encounter reaches its conclusion through the kind of anticlimactic resolution that characterizes most real conflicts. During a particularly elaborate exchange of swats and kicks, both participants notice that the grass you were fighting over has been eaten by a third kangaroo who wandered up during the excitement, and apparently decided to take advantage of the distraction to secure a free meal. This discovery leads to a moment of shared philosophical contemplation about the nature of desire, the futility of conflict, and the possibility that the entire confrontation was based on assumptions about scarcity that may not have been accurate in the first place. The realization that your territorial dispute has been rendered meaningless by the practical action of a non-participant introduces an element of absurdity that makes continuing the fight seem somehow ridiculous. The aftermath involves an awkward parting, where both parties pretend the whole thing was just a friendly sparring session designed to maintain combat readiness rather than a genuine territorial conflict with real stakes and potential consequences. This face-saving interpretation allows everyone to walk away with dignity intact, though it also leaves unresolved the underlying questions about territorial boundaries and grass ownership that led to the confrontation in the first place. As you mature, the concept of territory begins to make sense in the way that insurance policies do, boring but necessary, involving a lot of fine print that seems designed to cover situations you hope never to encounter, and requiring regular attention to maintain benefits that are easy to take for granted until something goes wrong. Your corner of the outback starts to feel less like a random collection of rocks and plants that happen to be convenient for your current needs and more like home, complete with all the mundane responsibilities that entails. This transformation happens gradually, without any specific moment of recognition, like slowly realizing that you've developed opinions about home improvement and neighborhood maintenance without consciously deciding to become the kind of creature who cares about such things. You develop preferences that solidify into requirements with the kind of inevitability that characterizes most adult decision-making. Certain waterholes taste better than others, not just because of mineral content or cleanliness, but because of factors like accessibility, social atmosphere, and the quality of the surrounding conversation among regular visitors. Specific shade trees offer superior afternoon napping conditions due to optimal combinations of temperature control, wind protection, and strategic positioning that provides good visibility of potential threats or opportunities. Some grazing areas provide grass with just the right texture and flavor profile to make eating feel like a pleasant activity rather than mere biological necessity. These preferences gradually solidify into routines, and routines into what might generously be called a lifestyle, though it's a lifestyle built around the fundamental principle that most of life's genuine satisfactions come from things that require minimal effort once you've figured out how to do them correctly. The maintenance of territory proves less dramatic than expected, involving mainly the kind of passive-aggressive boundary enforcement that would make suburban homeowners proud and property lawyers wealthy. Most territorial management consists of strategic positioning during grazing, being visible in areas you consider yours without necessarily preventing others from passing through, but maintaining enough presence to remind everyone that this space has an established resident who pays attention to who visits and how they behave while they're there. Meaningful looks exchanged over disputed water sources constitute a major component of territorial communication, requiring the development of a sophisticated vocabulary of facial expressions and body language that can convey complex messages about ownership, usage rights, and the consequences of various forms of inappropriate behavior. These silent conversations often resolve potential conflicts before they escalate to the point where actual confrontation becomes necessary. The occasional display of hopping prowess serves to remind everyone that you're still physically capable of making poor decisions if necessary, but these demonstrations are carefully calibrated to suggest competence and readiness rather than aggression or instability. It's a delicate balance between projecting strength and avoiding the kind of provocative behavior that might encourage someone to test your resolve through direct challenge. You begin to understand your place in the broader ecosystem, not quite at the top, where the large predators and most dominant males operate according to rules that involve considerably more violence and considerably less room for negotiation, but certainly not at the bottom, where survival requires the kind of constant vigilance and creative problem-solving that makes relaxation essentially impossible. Instead, you occupy somewhere in the comfortable middle, where most of life's genuine surprises can be avoided through careful planning and strategic cowardice. It's a position that suits your temperament, which has evolved from eager but incompetent to capable but unmotivated, possessing the skills necessary for handling most challenges that arise, but preferring to apply those skills to avoiding challenges rather than seeking them out for sport or personal growth. The seasons begin to feel like old friends with predictable personalities and familiar patterns of behavior. Summer arrives with its familiar crankiness, bringing heat that makes everything more difficult and water sources that require longer journeys to reach. Winter provides mild-mannered relief that makes extended activity possible and outdoor sleeping comfortable, though it also brings its own challenges in the form of reduced food availability and weather patterns that require different strategies for staying warm and dry. Spring shows up like an overly enthusiastic party guest who's brought too many flowers and too much optimism about outdoor activities, flooding the landscape with new growth and reproductive opportunities that create their own complications and social pressures. Each season requires subtle adjustments to your routine, but nothing so dramatic as to require actual effort or significant changes to the basic patterns that have proven successful. Your territorial boundaries evolve through a combination of practical considerations and social negotiations that take place over months rather than days. Areas that provide reliable resources become more important to defend, while marginal territories that offer mainly symbolic value can be yielded to more ambitious neighbors without significant loss of actual quality of life. The process involves a kind of slow-motion diplomacy conducted through patterns of usage, presence, and response to encroachment that establishes understood boundaries without requiring formal agreements or explicit confrontation. Over time, these informal arrangements solidify into stable territorial divisions that provide security and predictability for all parties involved, assuming everyone continues to follow the unwritten rules that make the system function. Water rights emerge as a particularly complex aspect of territorial management, since access to reliable hydration affects not just your own survival, but also your attractiveness as a neighbor and social partner. The politics of waterhole usage involve considerations of timing, courtesy, and the kind of reciprocal respect that makes shared resources sustainable over the long term. Some water sources are clearly understood to be communal, available to anyone who approaches with appropriate respect and doesn't abuse the privilege through wasteful or antisocial behavior. Others carry implicit restrictions based on proximity to established territories, with usage rights that reflect the investment various individuals have made in maintaining access and protecting the resource from contamination or overuse. Your own territorial holdings expand gradually, not through conquest, but through the kind of slow territorial drift that occurs when no one else wants to challenge you for patches of ground that offer nothing more exciting than adequate grass and reliable shade. You now control roughly 5 acres of outback real estate, which sounds impressive until you consider that most of it consists of dirt, rocks, and plants that exist primarily to make other plants look appealing by comparison. The maintenance of this territory requires what you've come to think of as aggressive passivity, being present and visible enough to remind everyone that this space is occupied, but not so aggressively territorial that anyone feels compelled to test your resolve through direct challenge. It's a delicate balance that relies more on consistency than confrontation, like being a bouncer at a very boring nightclub where the biggest excitement is someone trying to cut in line for water and the most serious infractions involve improper grass etiquette. Romance returns to your life with all the subtlety of a freight train operated by someone who's never seen subtlety before and isn't entirely convinced it's a real thing anyway. The mating season arrives like an unwelcome reminder that biology has plans for you that don't necessarily align with your current preference for quiet afternoons, predictable meal schedules, and social interactions that don't require performance anxiety or complex emotional negotiations. The transformation begins gradually, with subtle changes in your awareness and priorities that you initially attribute to seasonal variations or random fluctuations in mood. You find yourself paying more attention to the personal grooming habits that had become routine maintenance, investing additional time and effort in activities like dust, bathing, and fur arrangement that suddenly seem to carry social significance rather than merely practical hygiene benefits. Your territorial behavior intensifies without conscious decision-making, as if some deeper part of your kangaroo brain has decided that your current holdings require more aggressive defense and more prominent advertising of their quality, and your fitness as their primary occupant. The boundaries that had been maintained through casual presence and occasional meaningful looks now demand more active patrolling and more frequent displays of ownership. Suddenly, every interaction with the opposite sex becomes loaded with significance you're not entirely sure you understand, transforming previously straightforward social encounters into complex negotiations involving body language you've never had to consider before, and subtext that seems to require advanced degrees in psychology and anthropology to interpret correctly. Casual encounters while grazing transform into carefully choreographed performances where every movement and gesture carries potential meaning about your intentions, availability, and general fitness as a potential romantic partner. The simple act of sharing a waterhole becomes an opportunity for displays of virility that leave everyone involved feeling slightly ridiculous, but somehow compelled to continue the performance anyway. You find yourself engaging in behaviors that would have seemed absurd just months earlier, strategic flexing while drinking, as if the act of hydration requires the kind of muscular demonstration usually reserved for heavy lifting competitions. Demonstrating your hopping technique for audiences who didn't ask for a demonstration becomes a regular feature of social gatherings, with each performance designed to showcase coordination, power, and the kind of athletic confidence that suggests competence in other areas of life as well. Competitive grazing emerges as a new social activity, eating grass with an intensity and focus that suggests it might escape if you don't consume it fast enough, or alternatively, that your ability to efficiently process vegetation represents a crucial skill that potential partners should evaluate when making romantic decisions. These feeding displays often attract small audiences of other kangaroos who observe with the kind of polite interest usually reserved for community theatre performances. The actual courtship process proves to be a masterclass in mixed signals and misunderstood intentions that would challenge professional diplomats and experienced negotiators. What you interpret as friendly interest turns out to be polite tolerance, while what seems like complete indifference occasionally reveals itself as sophisticated flirtation operating according to rules that no one has explained and which seem to change without notice. You begin to suspect that female kangaroos operate according to a complex social code that was distributed while you were off practicing your hopping technique or attending to other practical matters that seemed important at the time, but now appear to have been elaborate distractions from the real business of learning how romantic communication actually works. The females in your area demonstrate a maddening ability to send signals that seem clear and unambiguous until you respond to them, at which point they turn out to have meant something completely different, or to have been tests of your ability to interpret subtext rather than actual invitations for romantic engagement. This creates a social environment where every interaction requires multiple levels of analysis, and where the safest response to apparent interest is often careful inaction while you attempt to determine whether you're being invited to participate or being evaluated on your ability to recognize that participation would be inappropriate. Your first serious romantic encounter unfolds with all the grace and coordination you've come to expect from your major life events. The object of your affection, a female with particularly elegant ears and an attitude that suggests she's never met a problem she couldn't solve by ignoring it until it went away, responds to your advances with the kind of patient amusement usually reserved for watching small children attempt complex tasks that they're obviously not ready to handle successfully. Her approach to courtship appears to be based on the principle that genuine romantic interest must be demonstrated through persistence in the face of apparent indifference, creating a dynamic where your job is to continue making romantic overtures, while her job is to remain sufficiently unimpressed to test your commitment without actually discouraging you entirely. This leads to a series of interactions that feel like elaborate dances where only one partner knows the steps and the other is trying to follow along without stepping on anyone's feet. The relationship, such as it is, follows the traditional kangaroo courtship pattern. Extended periods of parallel grazing, interrupted by moments of what might charitably be called aggressive snuggling. These intimate encounters involve a combination of nuzzling, grooming, and physical positioning that serves both romantic and practical purposes, establishing pair bonds while also providing mutual assistance with hygiene tasks that are difficult to perform solo. It's not exactly romance as portrayed in popular culture, but it has its own peculiar charm, like a dance choreographed by someone who's heard dancing described but never actually seen it performed. The relationship develops its own internal logic and patterns of interaction that make sense to the participants even if they would seem bizarre to outside observers. The courtship period extends over several weeks, during which your daily routine becomes organized around opportunities to spend time near your romantic interest, while maintaining the pretense that these encounters are coincidental rather than carefully planned. This requires developing new skills in casual positioning and strategic grazing that allow you to be available for interaction without appearing desperate or overly focused on romantic outcomes. The social dynamics of courtship extend beyond the primary relationship to include complex negotiations with other potential suitors, territorial adjustments that accommodate pair bonding activities, and modifications to your established routine that allow for the kind of flexibility that successful relationships apparently require. These changes feel significant while they're happening, but gradually become part of a new normal that incorporates romantic partnership into the broader framework of daily survival and territorial maintenance. Your 30s arrive without fanfare, settling over your life like dust after a windstorm gradually, inevitably, and with a tendency to get into places you didn't know existed, coating familiar experiences with a patina that makes everything look slightly different while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The dramatic uncertainties of youth have been replaced by the comfortable predictabilities of middle age, and you find yourself surprisingly okay with this development. The constant questioning and experimentation that characterized your earlier years has given way to a settled confidence in approaches and routines that have proven successful through repeated application and gradual refinement. Your daily routine has crystallized into something that would make a Swiss watchmaker proud. Wake up just before dawn, not from enthusiasm or eagerness to begin another day of adventure, but because your back complains if you sleep too long on hard ground, and your bladder has developed opinions about scheduling that it enforces through increasingly urgent morning reminders. The pre-dawn survey of your territory has become both practical necessity and meditative ritual. You check for overnight developments, which are usually limited to new rocks that have appeared through geological processes too slow to observe directly, old rocks that have wandered off to pursue careers in other locations, and the occasional evidence that various neighbors have passed through your area during the night on business that remains their own concern. The serious business of breakfast has evolved from the simple expedient of eating whatever you can find to the sophisticated practice of carefully curated grazing experiences. You've developed opinions about grass, strong opinions that you're prepared to defend in casual conversation, and detailed enough to support extended discussions about seasonal variations, optimal harvesting techniques, and the subtle factors that distinguish truly excellent vegetation from merely adequate forage. The tender shoots that grow near the red rocks have a subtle sweetness that pairs well with morning contemplation and the kind of philosophical reflection that comes naturally during the quiet hours when the day's possibilities remain largely theoretical. The broader leaves found in the shadow of the scrub oaks provide a more substantial foundation for the day's activities, offering the kind of sustained nutrition that supports extended periods of territorial maintenance and social interaction. The occasional wildflower offers a touch of variety that prevents your palate from becoming too set in its ways and provides the sort of culinary adventure that keeps eating interesting without requiring dramatic departures from bees' established preferences. These floral treats appear seasonally and require some flexibility in routing and timing to harvest at peak quality, adding an element of pleasant unpredictability to otherwise routine activities. The other members of your loose social group have similarly settled into their respective roles in the ongoing community drama. There's the old male who's claimed the prime shade tree and defends it with the dedication of someone guarding the last good parking spot at a popular destination, maintaining his position through a combination of physical presence and the kind of glowering disapproval that discourages casual challenges to his authority. The group of middle-aged females has formed what appears to be an informal book club, except instead of discussing literature, they exchange information about the best grazing spots, water source reliability, weather prediction techniques, and the personal histories of various community members. Their conversations provide a reliable source of local news and social analysis that keeps everyone informed about developments that might affect territorial decisions or social relationships. The younger kangaroos continue to approach life with the assumption that everything is either a crisis requiring immediate dramatic response or an adventure offering opportunities for personal growth through risk-taking and experimentation. They provide entertainment through their predictable overreactions to minor events and their touching faith in the possibility that their problems are unique and their solutions particularly clever. Weather patterns have become as familiar as old friends, with predictable personalities and reliable habits. You can predict rain by observing the behavior of ants 3 days in advance, having learned to recognize the subtle changes in their activity patterns that indicate atmospheric pressure variations, imperceptible to creatures without their specialized sensory equipment. Temperature changes reveal themselves in the quality of morning light and the way shadows fall across familiar landmarks, providing advance warning that allows for appropriate adjustments to daily planning. Your internal calendar, based on the blooming cycles of various plants and the migration patterns of seasonal visitors, has become sophisticated enough to make you something of a local meteorologist. Your forecasts are sought after mainly by creatures who share your investment in knowing when to seek shelter, when to expect water availability to change, and when seasonal food sources will become available or disappear. Your territory has expanded gradually through the kind of slow territorial drift that occurs when no one else wants to challenge you for patches of ground that offer nothing more exciting than adequate grass and reliable shade, but which provide the kind of stable foundation that makes long-term planning possible. You now control roughly 5 acres of outback real estate, which sounds impressive until you consider that most of it consists of dirt, rocks, and plants that exist primarily to make other plants look appealing by comparison. The maintenance of this territory requires what you've come to think of as aggressive passivity, being present and visible enough to remind everyone that this space is occupied, and that its occupant pays attention to who visits and how they behave while they're there, but not so aggressively territorial that anyone feels compelled to test your resolve through direct challenge or competitive territorial expansion. It's a delicate balance that relies more on consistency than confrontation, like being a bouncer at a very boring nightclub, where the biggest excitement is someone trying to cut in line for water, and the most serious infractions involve improper grass, etiquette, or failure to observe established protocols for sharing scarce resources during drought periods. The social dynamics of middle age have simplified considerably compared to the complex negotiations of youth and early adulthood. Relationships are based more on mutual convenience and established patterns of cooperation than on dramatic emotional connections or romantic excitement. Friendships develop around shared interests in practical matters like territorial maintenance, resource sharing, and the kind of conversation that provides social stimulation without requiring significant emotional investment. Your daily routine includes regular social interaction that serves both practical and recreational purposes. Information exchange about environmental conditions, resource availability, and potential threats provides security benefits that justify the time investment, while casual conversation about familiar topics provides the kind of social stimulation that prevents isolation without demanding the energy expenditure that more intensive relationships require. The predictability of middle-aged social life offers its own satisfactions. You know what to expect from your regular companions, and they know what to expect from you, creating a stable social environment that supports individual activities while providing backup for situations that require collective response or collaborative problem solving. Age creeps up on you like a tourist with a camera gradually, then suddenly, and with results you didn't entirely anticipate, as if someone has been quietly rearranging your life while you were busy paying attention to other things, leaving you to discover the changes only when you stop to wonder why everything feels slightly different than it used to. One day you're a middle-aged kangaroo with reasonable hopping skills, well-established opinions about grass quality, and a comfortable routine that requires minimal adjustment for seasonal variations, and the next you're being treated with the kind of deference usually reserved for natural landmarks, objects of respect that have earned their status through the simple accomplishment of having remained in place long enough to become part of the permanent landscape. The transformation isn't marked by any particular ceremony or announcement, no formal recognition of your transition from regular community member to respected elder. Instead, you gradually notice that younger kangaroos have started seeking you out for advice about territory disputes, grazing strategies, and the complex social dynamics of mob life. This is puzzling, since you're fairly certain you never volunteered for a leadership role and your primary qualification seems to be has survived this long without doing anything spectacularly stupid. The realization of your new status arrives through accumulated small observations rather than dramatic revelation. Conversations that once involved mutual exchange of information begin to shift toward younger kangaroos, asking questions and waiting for your responses, with the kind of attentive silence that suggests they consider your opinions particularly valuable. Your casual comments about weather patterns or territorial management are received with the respectful consideration usually reserved for expert testimony. Your physical appearance has changed in ways that contribute to this perception of wisdom and authority. Your fur has developed the kind of weathered quality that speaks of extensive experience with various environmental challenges. Your movements have acquired the deliberate pace that comes with knowing exactly where you're going and being confident that you'll get there without needing to hurry. Your posture suggests the relaxed alertness of someone who's seen enough to know what deserves attention and what can safely be ignored. The other kangaroos in your area begin to treat your territory with additional respect, as if your extended residence has conferred some special significance on the land itself. Younger visitors are more careful about their behavior while passing through, and conflicts that might once have encroached on your boundaries now tend to resolve themselves at a respectful distance from your established areas. Your advice, when requested, tends toward the practical rather than the inspirational, reflecting a lifetime of experience with the difference between solutions that sound impressive and solutions that actually work. Questions about territorial conflicts are met with suggestions about strategic retreat and the benefits of finding hills that aren't worth fighting, over advice that occasionally disappoints younger kangaroos who are hoping for guidance about how to win confrontations rather than how to avoid them. Inquiries about romance receive guidance about the importance of not taking rejection personally and the surprising effectiveness of simply being consistently present and reasonably pleasant, rather than relying on dramatic gestures or complex strategies that require more energy than most relationships can justify. These recommendations are based on observations of what actually produces successful long-term partnerships rather than what makes for exciting stories about romantic conquest. The younger generation seems to find this perspective refreshing, though you suspect they were initially expecting something more along the lines of ancient kangaroo wisdom involving mystical insights about the nature of hopping, secret meanings behind wind patterns, or traditional knowledge passed down through generations of spiritual kangaroo leaders. Instead, they get pragmatic observations about the benefits of napping during the hottest part of the day and the importance of keeping track of which waterholes dry up first during drought seasons. Your teaching method, such as it is, relies heavily on the principle that most practical wisdom can't be transmitted through abstract explanation, but must be learned through direct experience, guided by someone who's already made the relevant mistakes. You offer context and perspective, rather than detailed instructions, helping younger kangaroos understand what to pay attention to and what questions to ask themselves, rather than providing specific answers that might not apply to their particular circumstances. Your new status comes with certain privileges that you didn't realize you wanted until you had them. The best grazing spots are yielded to you with respectful nods, not because you demand priority access, but because others have decided that your seniority deserves recognition. Disputes are brought to you for mediation, with both parties accepting your judgment with the kind of trust that reflects confidence in your fairness and wisdom. You've developed a reputation as someone who can be counted on for reasonable solutions to unreasonable problems. The kind of elder who can look at complicated situations and identify the essential issues that need to be addressed, while ignoring the dramatic complications that make problems seem more complex than they actually are. This skill appears to be valued highly in a community where many conflicts arise from misunderstandings and emotional reactions rather than genuine incompatibility of interests. The responsibility of elder status proves less burdensome than you might have expected, mainly because your approach emphasizes guidance and perspective rather than active intervention in other creatures' problems. You provide information and context that help others make their own decisions rather than taking on the exhausting role of actually solving everyone's problems for them. Your influence operates mainly through example and availability rather than active leadership. Younger kangaroos observe your daily routines and territorial management strategies, learning from your demonstrated approaches to common challenges. They know they can approach you for advice when needed, but they also understand that your wisdom comes in the form of helping them think through situations rather than providing simple answers to complex questions. Teaching, you discover, is mostly a matter of being available when someone finally gets curious enough to ask the right questions, combined with the patience to wait for those moments when another creature is genuinely ready to learn, rather than just looking for quick solutions to immediate problems. Your students are the younger members of the mob who've reached that crucial stage of development where they realize that survival might require more than enthusiasm and good reflexes, that long-term success in kangaroo life depends on accumulated wisdom, careful observation, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from understanding patterns that reveal themselves over extended periods of time. Your curriculum, such as it is, covers the essential skills of kangaroo life that can't be learned through trial and error without significant risk or waste of time and energy. Advanced grazing techniques, including the subtle art of grass quality assessment, require the kind of palate development that benefits from guided experience with different vegetation types under various environmental conditions. Weather prediction through environmental observation involves learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicate atmospheric changes days before they become obvious to creatures who haven't developed the necessary sensitivity to environmental cues. This skill can mean the difference between being prepared for drought conditions and discovering water scarcity when it's too late to adjust territorial strategies or food storage approaches. Conflict avoidance strategies that actually work focus on recognizing potential problems early enough to address them through prevention rather than confrontation. This involves understanding the social dynamics that lead to territorial disputes, the personality types that are most likely to create problems, and the environmental conditions that increase stress levels and make conflicts more likely to escalate. Perhaps most importantly, you teach the critically important skill of knowing when something is not your problem, recognizing the situations where intervention will cost more energy than it saves, and where the best solution is strategic disengagement rather than attempted resolution. This lesson proves particularly valuable for young kangaroos who tend to approach every situation as if it requires their immediate attention and personal involvement. The lessons take place during the natural rhythms of daily life, rather than formal instruction sessions, allowing students to learn practical skills in the contexts where they'll actually need to apply them. A young Joey struggling with territorial anxiety learns about the benefits of strategic positioning while you demonstrate how to claim space without advertising your presence to every potential challenger in the area, showing through example how confidence and caution can be combined effectively. A female dealing with unwanted romantic attention receives guidance about the power of selective blindness and strategic deafness, while you show her the best escape routes that don't look like escape routes, paths and techniques that allow graceful withdrawal from uncomfortable situations without creating the kind of dramatic confrontation that might make future social interactions more difficult. Your teaching style has evolved to match your personality, patient, practical, and occasionally dryly humorous, reflecting your understanding that most learning happens through gradual absorption of principles rather than dramatic revelations or intensive training sessions. You've learned that most problems resolve themselves if you wait long enough, and that the majority of crises are actually just Tuesday, wearing a disguise, temporary difficulties that seem overwhelming in the moment but prove manageable, with appropriate perspective and basic competence. This viewpoint proves surprisingly popular with students who've grown tired of advice that assumes they want to spend their lives pursuing drama and excitement, or that treats every challenge as an opportunity for personal growth through intense struggle. Your approach offers an alternative model based on sustainability, efficiency, and the radical idea that a successful life might be one where most days are relatively uneventful. The most valuable lessons you pass on aren't about specific techniques, but about the art of sustainable living approaches to daily life that can be maintained over decades without exhausting your physical or emotional resources. How to pace yourself for a life that's measured in decades rather than seasons, recognizing that the strategies that work for short-term survival often prove counterproductive when applied to long-term success. How to find satisfaction in routine without becoming so rigid that change becomes impossible, maintaining the flexibility needed to adapt to new circumstances while preserving the stability that makes planning and emotional security possible. This balance requires constant subtle adjustments rather than dramatic transformations, and learning to make those adjustments skillfully can mean the difference between a life of constant stress and one of reasonable contentment. How to maintain your territorial claims without exhausting yourself in constant conflict, using the minimum amount of energy necessary to preserve your essential interests, while avoiding the kind of aggressive expansion or rigid defense that creates unnecessary enemies and depletes resources that could be better used for other purposes. Your students gradually learn that most of the wisdom you share isn't particularly exotic or dramatic. It's the accumulated result of paying attention to what actually works rather than what sounds impressive or feels emotionally satisfying in the moment. The insights that prove most valuable are often the ones that initially seem obvious or boring, but which reveal their true worth only when applied consistently over extended periods. The contemplative phase of your life arrives like a comfortable chair you didn't know you needed, gradually becoming essential to your daily routine until you can't remember how you managed without these extended periods of peaceful observation and unhurried thought. Your days now include extended periods of what younger kangaroos might mistake for boredom, but which you recognize as the luxury of unstructured time, moments when you can simply exist without the pressure of achieving, defending, or improving anything. These intervals of pure being, free from the demands of goal-oriented activity, prove surprisingly restorative and intellectually stimulating in ways that more active pursuits never quite achieved. These reflective periods often occur during the afternoon heat, when sensible creatures seek shade and wait for the world to become tolerable again rather than pushing through environmental conditions that make activity unnecessarily difficult. You've claimed a particular spot beneath a gnarled tree that provides excellent shelter and a commanding view of most of your territory, making it ideal for the serious business of thinking about nothing in particular while remaining alert to anything that might require actual attention. The tree itself has become a kind of partner in your contemplative practice, its ancient trunk and spreading branches, creating a microenvironment that feels separate from the broader landscape while remaining connected to the natural rhythms that govern life in the outback. The shade it provides changes throughout the day, creating different atmospheric conditions that influence your mood and thinking patterns in subtle but noticeable ways. From this elevated vantage point, you watch the seasons cycle through their familiar routines with the kind of appreciation that comes from having observed the same patterns long enough to understand their deeper significance. Summer arrives with its usual complaints about everything being too hot and too dry, followed by autumn's brief period of reasonable weather that feels like a negotiated truce between opposing forces, winter's mild-mannered attempt at providing relief that never quite lives up to its promises, and spring's enthusiastic but ultimately temporary renewal that brings energy and optimism before settling back into more sustainable patterns. You've seen this cycle enough times now that you can appreciate its reliability rather than being surprised by its variations, understanding that the seasonal changes that once seemed unpredictable actually follow patterns that reveal themselves only through extended observation. This knowledge brings a sense of security and continuity that makes individual seasonal challenges feel less threatening and more like familiar problems with known solutions. The landscape itself has become a kind of autobiography, written in rocks and plants and well-worn paths, each feature carrying associations that connect your personal history to the physical environment in ways that make the territory feel like an extension of your own identity. That depression near the red boulder is where you sheltered during the particularly memorable storm of 3 seasons ago, an event that taught you important lessons about emergency preparedness and the value of maintaining multiple secure locations for extreme weather events. The worn patch of ground beneath the acacia marks where you spent countless afternoons perfecting your territorial display techniques, developing the subtle combination of assertiveness and restraint that has served you well in numerous boundary negotiations. The network of trails connecting various grazing spots and water sources represents years of accumulated wisdom about the most efficient ways to navigate your small corner of the world, incorporating lessons learned from seasonal variations, weather patterns, and changes in vegetation that affect optimal routing decisions. Your relationships with the other creatures in your area have settled into comfortable patterns of mutual tolerance and occasional cooperation that require minimal active maintenance, while providing significant benefits for all parties involved. The echidna who passes through your territory monthly is always welcomed with a polite nod and left to pursue its mysterious agenda without interference, an arrangement that seems to work well for both species despite the complete absence of formal communication about expectations or boundaries. The various birds who nest in your trees are treated as tenants with reasonable lease agreements. They provide entertainment through their ongoing commentary on local events, early warning about weather changes through their behavioral patterns, and occasional assistance with insect control. In return, they're allowed to criticize your hopping technique, steal occasional bits of food, and generally conduct their avian business without interference from terrestrial concerns about property rights or noise ordinances. Memory becomes a more prominent part of your daily experience, not in the sense of dwelling on the past or feeling nostalgic about earlier periods of your life, but in the way that accumulated experience informs present decisions and provides context for understanding current situations. You remember drought seasons and their patterns, territorial disputes and their resolutions, successful and unsuccessful survival strategies, and the gradual evolution of your relationship with the environment that has shaped most of your adult life. This knowledge sits quietly in the background of your consciousness, available when needed but not demanding constant attention or emotional energy. Unlike the anxious hypervigilance that characterized your younger years, this mature awareness operates with efficiency and confidence, focusing attention on genuinely important information while filtering out the constant stream of minor concerns that once seemed to require immediate response. The quality of your attention has changed in ways that make simple activities more satisfying and complex problems easier to understand. You can spend extended periods observing cloud formations, grass growth patterns, or the social interactions of other creatures without feeling restless or distracted, finding genuine interest in phenomena that your younger self would have dismissed as insufficiently stimulating. This enhanced capacity for sustained observation has revealed layers of complexity in your familiar environment that were invisible when your attention was constantly divided among multiple urgent concerns. You notice seasonal variations in plant behavior, that follow patterns more subtle than simple weather responses, social dynamics among different species that suggest sophisticated forms of interspecies communication, and environmental changes that indicate long-term trends rather than temporary fluctuations. Change arrives in the form of younger kangaroos who've decided that your territory would suit their needs perfectly, though they're polite enough to approach the transition as a gradual negotiation rather than a hostile takeover. It's less like being conquered and more like being slowly and respectfully replaced by more energetic versions of yourself, creatures who possess similar goals and values, but approach them with the kind of ambitious intensity that you remember from your own younger years. The process begins with increased traffic through your area as young adults find reasons to graze near your borders, drink from your water sources, and generally make their presence known without quite challenging your authority directly. They're testing boundaries in the time-honored tradition of their species, but with the kind of respectful caution that suggests they recognize your status and experience, while also making clear their serious interest in eventually establishing their own territorial claims in areas that are currently under your control. Their approach demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of kangaroo social protocols. They maintain appropriate distance while making themselves visible, show deference through body language and positioning while gradually increasing their presence, and engage in the kind of casual social interaction that establishes familiarity without implying immediate challenge to existing territorial arrangements. You find yourself curious about rather than threatened by this development, recognizing in these newcomers the same combination of ambition and uncertainty that characterized your own approach to territorial establishment decades earlier. These young kangaroos represent a different generation's approach to the same basic challenges you've been managing for years, bringing fresh perspectives and energy to problems that have become routine for you through long experience. Their techniques are similar to yours but adapted for their time and circumstances, like watching someone perform a familiar song with their own interpretation and emphasis. They've learned from observing your methods and those of other established adults, but they're also developing innovations that reflect changes in environmental conditions, population density, and resource availability that have occurred since you were establishing your own territorial claims. The gradual transfer of responsibility happens naturally, without formal ceremonies or dramatic confrontations that might create unnecessary conflict or social disruption. You simply begin spending more time in the less disputed areas of your territory, leaving the prime spots available for the more ambitious younger kangaroos who still believe that securing the best grazing land is worth the effort required to defend it against all potential challenges. This transition feels appropriate rather than disappointing, reflecting your own evolution from someone who measured success primarily through territorial acquisition and resource control to someone who values comfort, security, and social harmony more than competitive advantage. The energy required to maintain exclusive control over the most desirable areas of your territory no longer seems like a worthwhile investment when weighed against the benefits of reducing conflict and simplifying your daily routine. Your role evolves from primary occupant to respected elder in residence, a position that carries different responsibilities and privileges while maintaining your connection to the territory that has been your home for most of your adult life. The younger generation seeks your advice about established territorial boundaries, seasonal patterns that affect resource availability, and the personalities of neighboring kangaroos they'll need to learn to work with as they develop their own territorial claims and social relationships. You provide this information with the same practical approach you've applied to everything else throughout your life: straightforward, useful, and without unnecessary drama or emotional complications. Your guidance focuses on helping the new generation understand the context and history that inform current territorial arrangements rather than trying to influence their specific decisions about how to manage their own relationships and responsibilities. The knowledge you share includes practical information about seasonal variations in water availability, grazing quality in different areas under various weather conditions, the territorial preferences and behavioral patterns of established neighbors, and the social dynamics that govern community relationships during normal periods and crisis situations. This advisory role proves satisfying in ways you hadn't anticipated, providing opportunities to contribute meaningfully to community welfare while reducing your own direct involvement in territorial management and conflict resolution. You can offer perspective and context without taking responsibility for implementation, allowing younger kangaroos to benefit from your experience while making their own decisions about how to apply that knowledge to their specific circumstances. The transition also brings a new kind of social interaction that focuses more on knowledge sharing and less on competitive positioning or territorial negotiation. Conversations with the younger generation often involve genuine curiosity about your experiences and observations, rather than the careful diplomatic exchanges that characterized most adult social interactions during your prime territorial years. Your last season arrives with the understated dignity that has characterized most of your major life transitions, not as a dramatic conclusion to an epic narrative, but as a natural continuation of the same practical, unhurried approach that has guided your entire adult life. There's no dramatic decline or sudden crisis, just a gradual slowing down that feels more like a natural conclusion than an ending, similar to the way afternoon gradually becomes evening without any specific moment when day transforms into night. Your territory has been successfully transferred to capable successors who understand its value and possess the energy and commitment necessary to maintain the territorial arrangements and social relationships that you've spent decades developing. Your advice is still occasionally sought but no longer desperately needed, and you find yourself genuinely pleased by this development rather than feeling displaced or forgotten by the community that has been your social context for most of your life. Your days have settled into a rhythm that prioritizes comfort over achievement, reflection over action, and appreciation over acquisition. The urgent concerns that once demanded immediate attention have either been resolved through successful long-term strategies or handed over to others who are better positioned to address them with the energy and focus they require. The daily routines that have structured your life for years become gentler and more flexible as you allow your body's natural rhythms to guide your schedule rather than forcing yourself to maintain patterns that no longer serve your current needs and capabilities. You wake when your body decides it's ready rather than when external circumstances demand attention, allowing for the kind of restorative sleep that becomes more important as your energy reserves diminish. Meals become smaller and more leisurely, focused on quality rather than quantity as your caloric needs decrease and your appreciation for subtle flavors increases. The serious business of territorial maintenance gives way to casual observation of how the new generation handles the responsibilities you've passed along, providing entertainment without requiring personal investment in the outcomes of situations you no longer control. Your favorite resting spot beneath the old tree becomes even more important, serving as both a comfortable retreat and an observation post for monitoring the ongoing soap opera of kangaroo social dynamics. From this familiar vantage point, you watch the younger generation navigate the same challenges you once faced, making similar mistakes and discovering similar solutions, but with their own unique variations on familiar themes that reflect their personalities and the specific circumstances of their time. The landscape that has been your home for decades takes on a different quality, less like a collection of resources to be managed, and more like an old friend whose company you've learned to fully appreciate after years of shared experience. Every rock and tree carries associations and memories that connect your personal history to the physical environment, but instead of feeling heavy with the weight of the past, these connections provide a sense of completion and belonging that makes your current reduced circumstances feel appropriate rather than limiting. Weather patterns continue their eternal cycle, but your relationship with them shifts from practical necessity to aesthetic appreciation as you develop the luxury of experiencing environmental changes without needing to respond to them with immediate action or strategic planning. You still seek shelter during storms and shade during heat waves, but you also find yourself simply enjoying the way morning light falls across the red rocks, the sound of wind moving through the scrub brush, and the particular quality of silence that arrives just before dawn. The other creatures in your ecosystem continue their own daily routines, and you take pleasure in their predictable presence without feeling responsible for managing your relationships with them or protecting your resources from their competing interests. The birds still provide commentary on events they only partially understand. The lizards continue their mysterious agenda of judging everyone and everything, and the occasional echidna still wanders through with the focused determination of someone late for an important appointment that remains eternally urgent and forever unexplained. Your legacy, such as it is, lives on in the practical knowledge you've shared with younger kangaroos, the territory you've maintained and improved through careful stewardship, and the example you've provided of how to live a satisfying life without requiring it to be an extraordinary one. The techniques and strategies you've developed will continue to influence territorial management and social relationships in your area long after you're no longer available to provide direct guidance or personal example. The younger kangaroos who've inherited your corner of the outback will face their own challenges and develop their own solutions, but they'll do so with the foundation of accumulated wisdom that you and others like you have provided through patient teaching and consistent demonstration of sustainable approaches to the basic challenges of kangaroo life. As the season progresses and your energy naturally declines, you find yourself spending more time in peaceful contemplation, less concerned with the daily details of survival and more focused on simply being present in the moment. The sun still rises and sets, the grass still grows, the wind still blows, and you remain a part of it all until, eventually, you become part of something even larger and more enduring, not through dramatic transformation, but through the same gradual, natural process that has characterized your entire approach to living: practical, unhurried, and ultimately successful in the most important ways that success can be measured. Spring arrives as it always does, with more enthusiasm than sense and a tendency to make promises it can't keep, flooding the landscape with optimistic green shoots and wildflowers that will spend the next few months learning hard lessons about the difference between ambition and sustainability in the Australian outback. In the territory that was once yours, new Joeys are discovering the same fundamental truths you learned decades ago through your own process of trial and error, experimentation, and gradual competence development. Hopping is considerably harder than it looks when observed from a distance. Grass has distinct personality traits that affect both flavor and nutritional value, and most of life's genuine crises can be solved by taking a strategic nap and waiting for circumstances to improve or reveal themselves to be less catastrophic than initially appeared. The current crop of young kangaroos approaches these challenges with the same combination of confidence and confusion that characterizes every generation's initial encounter with the practical requirements of independent survival. They bounce between moments of genuine competence and spectacular failures, gradually accumulating the experience base necessary for consistent success, while maintaining the kind of optimistic energy that makes learning possible, even when the lessons involve uncomfortable contact with thorny bushes or territorial neighbors with strong opinions about boundary violations. The young kangaroo who inherited your prime grazing spot, a patch of particularly excellent grass that you spent years defending and improving through careful cultivation and strategic territorial management, is dealing with his first serious territorial challenge, approaching it with the same combination of anxiety and determination you once brought to similar situations. His technique could use refinement, too much aggressive posturing that wastes energy without conveying genuine threat capability, not enough strategic positioning that would allow him to control the encounter without requiring actual physical confrontation. But he'll learn, you observe, with the kind of patient confidence that comes from having watched this same learning process repeat itself across multiple generations. They always do, eventually, either through successful adaptation or through the natural selection process that removes individuals who can't master the basic requirements of territorial life. The skills required for sustainable kangaroo existence aren't particularly complex or mysterious. They just require practice, observation, and the willingness to modify approaches that prove ineffective rather than persisting with strategies that feel emotionally satisfying but produce poor practical results. Your old resting place beneath the gnarled tree has become a popular spot for afternoon contemplation among the mob's more thoughtful members, serving the same function for the current generation that it served for you during your years of active territorial management and social leadership. Sometimes you catch glimpses of them there, working through their own versions of the problems that once seemed so urgent and important to you: territorial negotiations, romantic complications, seasonal planning challenges, and the ongoing puzzle of how to balance individual needs with community obligations. The view from beneath the tree hasn't changed much: the same red rocks, the same scrub brush, the same distant horizon where the sky meets the earth in a line that seems both permanent and somehow fragile. But each generation discovers this perspective anew, finding their own meanings in the same landscape that shaped your understanding of home, territory, and the subtle satisfactions of life lived within sustainable boundaries. The tree itself continues to provide excellent shelter and strategic positioning, its ancient trunk and spreading branches creating a microenvironment that feels separate from the broader challenges of outback life, while remaining connected to the natural rhythms that govern survival in this demanding landscape. The newer users of this space treat it with appropriate respect, understanding through some combination of inherited wisdom and direct experience that certain locations carry special significance that transcends their immediate practical utility. The waterhole continues to provide reliable hydration and occasional social drama, though the current disputes involve creatures you barely recognize, younger kangaroos whose personal histories and territorial ambitions represent entirely new chapters in the ongoing story of community life in your former territory. The specific personalities and individual conflicts change, but the basic patterns remain consistent. Questions about usage rights during drought periods, romantic tensions that affect waterhole etiquette, and the occasional territorial boundary disagreement that requires diplomatic resolution. The territorial boundaries you spent years establishing and defending have shifted and evolved, adapted to new personalities and changing circumstances, but the essential patterns remain fundamentally unchanged. The same geographic features that made certain areas valuable during your tenure continue to provide strategic advantages for the current generation: water access, superior grazing opportunities, optimal shade placement, and defensive positions that allow territorial control without requiring constant vigilance. These adaptations represent not the abandonment of your legacy, but its natural evolution as new residents apply their own personalities and priorities to the same basic challenges that have always defined successful kangaroo life in this area. The specific solutions may vary, but the underlying problems and the general approaches to solving them maintain continuity across generations, creating a stable foundation for community life that allows for individual variation while preserving essential systemic functionality. Looking back on your long life with the kind of comprehensive perspective that becomes possible only when most of the important decisions have been made and their consequences have had time to reveal themselves, the moments that seemed most significant at the time, the territorial victories that felt like major accomplishments, the romantic conquests that appeared to validate your attractiveness and social competence, the successful navigation of various crises that seemed to test your fundamental survival capabilities, have faded into the background of memory. What remains vivid and emotionally resonant are the quiet accumulations of ordinary experience. Thousands of mornings greeting the sun as it rises over familiar landscape. Countless afternoons spent in comfortable shade while observing the subtle changes that mark seasonal progression. The steady rhythm of seasons changing and changing back according to patterns that become more beautiful and meaningful the more often you witness their repetition. These daily experiences, which seemed unremarkable at the time they were happening, now reveal themselves to have been the actual substance of your life. The moments when you were most fully present and engaged with your environment, when the simple fact of being alive and aware felt sufficient without requiring additional drama or achievement to make existence worthwhile. The accumulation of these ordinary moments created a foundation of satisfaction and belonging that proved more durable than any of the more dramatic peaks and valleys of your emotional experience. You realize now that the boring life you lived was actually quite rich, filled with the kind of subtle satisfactions that only become apparent when viewed from sufficient temporal distance to understand their true significance. The security of familiar territory, which you once took for granted, as simply the context within which more interesting activities could take place, now reveals itself to have been one of the most valuable achievements of your entire life, providing the stable foundation that made everything else possible. The pleasure of predictable routines, which your younger self sometimes found limiting or monotonous, emerges in retrospective evaluation as a source of deep contentment that allowed you to find satisfaction in simple activities while maintaining the energy and attention necessary for responding effectively to genuine challenges when they arose. The deep satisfaction of problems solved through patience rather than drama, waiting for territorial disputes to resolve through natural boundary evolution rather than forcing confrontations, allowing romantic relationships to develop according to their own timelines rather than pushing for premature commitments. These approaches produced better outcomes with less stress and resource expenditure than more aggressive alternatives. These weren't consolation prizes for a life not fully lived, but the actual rewards of successful living. The development of approaches to daily challenges that could be sustained over decades while producing consistent satisfaction and security. The recognition that most problems resolve themselves if given sufficient time and space, and that the problems requiring immediate intervention are much rarer than your younger self believed, proved to be one of the most valuable insights of your entire existence. The younger generation, predictably, is convinced that they're the first to face genuine challenges, that their problems are uniquely complex and their solutions particularly clever. You remember feeling the same way during your own transition to independent adult life, and you recognize that this confidence is both necessary and temporary necessary because it provides the energy and optimism required for tackling difficult problems. Temporary because experience gradually reveals that most challenges are variations on familiar themes that have been faced successfully by previous generations. They'll learn, as you learned, that most problems are variations on familiar themes and that the best solutions are usually the most boring ones. The approaches that work consistently without requiring dramatic effort or creating unnecessary secondary complications. The solutions that can be implemented gradually and maintained easily, that don't depend on perfect conditions or exceptional personal performance, that integrate smoothly with existing routines rather than requiring complete lifestyle reorganization. Your territory, your relationships, your accumulated knowledge, all of it has been passed on to capable successors who will adapt it to their own needs and circumstances while preserving the essential elements that make sustainable kangaroo life possible in this challenging environment. This is how progress actually works. Not through dramatic revolutions that replace everything with untested alternatives, but through countless small improvements applied by generations of creatures who understand that sustainability requires thinking beyond your own immediate needs. Each generation builds on the foundation provided by their predecessors, while making modifications that reflect their own personalities, the specific challenges of their time, and the gradual evolution of environmental conditions that require ongoing adaptation without abandoning proven principles. The result is continuity that allows for change, stability that accommodates growth, and tradition that remains alive and relevant rather than becoming rigid and dysfunctional. The ecosystem that supported your long life continues to function according to the same basic principles that governed it when you were young. Balance maintained through countless individual decisions that somehow coordinate to produce systemic stability. Resources shared through systems of cooperation and competition that prevent any single species or individual from monopolizing essential assets. And change managed at a pace that allows adaptation without requiring constant crisis management or emergency response. This systemic stability doesn't arise from centralized planning or conscious coordination, but from the accumulated wisdom of countless individual decisions made by creatures who understand their own needs and capabilities while remaining aware of their interdependence with others. The result is a form of collective intelligence that operates below the level of conscious awareness, but produces outcomes more sophisticated than any individual could achieve through deliberate planning. The concept of sustainability, which emerged gradually in your understanding rather than arriving as a dramatic revelation, proves to be one of the most profound insights of your long life, not as an abstract principle imposed from outside your direct experience, but as a practical discovery about what actually works when applied consistently over extended periods in challenging environments. Sustainability, you've learned, isn't primarily about limitation or sacrifice, but about understanding the difference between approaches that can be maintained indefinitely and those that produce short-term benefits at the cost of long-term viability. The sustainable approaches often feel less exciting in the moment. They don't provide the immediate gratification of dramatic solutions or aggressive resource acquisition, but they compound over time to produce outcomes that exceed what can be achieved through more intensive strategies that burn out quickly. This insight applies to every aspect of kangaroo life. Territorial management that focuses on maintaining boundaries rather than constant expansion, social relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dominance, resource consumption that takes only what's needed rather than what's available, and conflict resolution that preserves long-term community stability rather than achieving short-term individual victories. The development of sustainable practices requires a different kind of intelligence than the quick thinking and aggressive response patterns that prove effective in crisis situations. It's the intelligence of long-term pattern recognition, of understanding how small decisions accumulate over time, of recognizing the hidden costs of approaches that seem efficient in isolation but create problems when scaled up or repeated consistently. Your own evolution towards sustainability happened gradually, through the accumulation of experience with both successful and unsuccessful approaches to common challenges. The territorial strategies that required constant vigilance and frequent confrontation eventually proved exhausting and ineffective compared to approaches based on strategic positioning and diplomatic boundary negotiation. The romantic relationships that demanded intense emotional investment and dramatic expression burned out more quickly than partnerships based on consistent compatibility and mutual support. The resource management approaches that focused on acquiring maximum quantities during periods of abundance created storage and defense problems that often negated the benefits of the initial acquisition, while strategies based on reliable access to adequate resources proved more secure and less stressful over multiple seasonal cycles. This gradual shift towards sustainability wasn't motivated by moral considerations or abstract environmental philosophy, but by practical recognition of what actually worked best for maintaining the kind of life you wanted to live: secure, comfortable, socially connected, and emotionally satisfying without requiring heroic effort or constant crisis management. The insights about sustainability that you've developed through your own experience prove to be applicable far beyond individual decision-making. The community structures that function most effectively over long periods are those that distribute costs and benefits fairly while maintaining flexibility for adaptation to changing circumstances. The territorial arrangements that remain stable across multiple generations are those that respect the legitimate needs of all parties while preventing any individual from accumulating excessive control over shared resources. The social dynamics that contribute to community health are those that allow for individual personality differences while maintaining shared standards for behavior that affects others. These systems develop through gradual negotiation and adjustment rather than dramatic reorganization, creating stability that feels natural rather than imposed. Your observation of these patterns has led to a deeper appreciation for the complex intelligence embedded in natural systems, the way that individual organisms, pursuing their own survival and reproduction, somehow coordinate to maintain ecosystem stability, the way that seasonal cycles balance periods of abundance and scarcity to prevent any single species from overwhelming the environment, the way that competition and cooperation interact to produce outcomes that benefit the entire system over time. This natural intelligence operates without conscious planning or centralized control, but it produces results that exceed what could be achieved through deliberate management by any individual or group. The recognition of this intelligence has influenced your own approach to problem solving, encouraging you to work with natural patterns rather than against them, to support existing systems rather than trying to replace them with untested alternatives. The sustainability insights that have shaped your mature approach to life extend beyond practical problem solving to influence your understanding of what constitutes a meaningful existence. The realization that the most satisfying life is often the one that requires the least dramatic intervention to maintain, that the deepest contentment comes from appreciation of what you already have rather than pursuit of what you might acquire, that the most valuable achievements are often the ones that feel effortless because they align with your natural capabilities and inclinations. This perspective doesn't eliminate challenge or growth from life, but it reframes them in terms of gradual development rather than dramatic transformation, sustainable improvement rather than revolutionary change, integration rather than replacement. The result is a life that feels both relaxed and purposeful, both stable and dynamic, both individual and connected to larger patterns of meaning and value. The landscape that shaped your character and provided the context for your entire existence will continue to shape other lives long after your individual story has ended, demonstrating the kind of continuity that transcends individual lifespans while accommodating the gradual changes that prevent stagnation and allow for adaptation to evolving conditions. The red rocks that served as landmarks and territorial markers throughout your life will keep their silent watch over this patch of outback for centuries beyond your personal timeline, weathering slowly according to geological processes that operate at temporal scales that make individual animal lives seem like brief episodes in much larger stories. Yet these rocks also change in response to smaller-scale influences. The gradual accumulation of soil and vegetation that alters drainage patterns, the activities of countless creatures who use them for shelter and navigation, the subtle shifts in climate that affect erosion rates and mineral exposure. The scrub brush that provided food, shelter, and territorial boundaries will continue its patient survival strategies, adapting to seasonal variations and long-term environmental changes through the same combination of flexibility and persistence that has allowed these plants to thrive in challenging conditions for thousands of years. Individual bushes may live or die according to local conditions and random events, but the species maintains continuity through reproduction, adaptation, and the gradual colonization of new areas when opportunities arise. The seasonal cycles that provided the temporal structure for your life will maintain their reliable rhythms, bringing the same sequence of weather patterns, resource availability changes, and reproductive opportunities that have governed life in this region for millennia. Yet these cycles also accommodate gradual long-term changes, shifts in average temperature and precipitation that alter the timing and intensity of seasonal transitions, variations in the species composition of plant and animal communities that affect food webs and territorial arrangements. Your contribution to this environmental continuity was simply to live well within it, to take what you needed without depleting the resources that others would require, to pass on what you learned in forms that others could adapt to their own circumstances, to maintain the territorial arrangements and social relationships that support community stability while allowing for individual variation and gradual improvement. This contribution might seem modest when measured against dramatic narratives of heroic achievement or revolutionary transformation, but it represents the kind of participation in larger systems that actually makes complex life possible. The health of any ecosystem depends on the accumulated effects of countless individual decisions to live sustainably, to share resources fairly, to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than destruction, to pass on knowledge and territory to the next generation in better condition than when it was received. The environmental changes that will affect future generations of kangaroos in this area will require the same basic survival skills and adaptive strategies that you developed throughout your life, but applied to gradually evolving conditions that will create new challenges and opportunities. Climate variations may alter the timing of seasonal transitions, requiring adjustments to migration patterns and reproductive scheduling. Changes in plant communities may affect grazing strategies and territorial boundaries. Variations in predator populations may require modifications to security practices and community cooperation. These changes will be manageable for future kangaroo generations if they maintain the same commitment to sustainable practices, long-term thinking, and community cooperation that has allowed your generation to thrive in challenging conditions. The specific techniques may need to evolve, but the underlying principles of careful observation, gradual adaptation, and cooperative resource management will remain essential for successful community life. The knowledge and territorial improvements that you're passing on to your successors provide a foundation for adaptation to these future challenges, rather than a rigid template that must be followed exactly. The water source management techniques you've developed can be modified for different precipitation patterns. The territorial boundary arrangements you've established can be adjusted for changes in population density or resource distribution. The conflict resolution methods you've learned can be applied to new types of disputes that arise from evolving social and environmental conditions. Your legacy in this landscape consists not only of the specific improvements you've made to territorial infrastructure and community relationships, but also of the demonstration you've provided that sustainable, satisfying life is possible even in challenging environments, using approaches that can be learned and applied by ordinary individuals without requiring exceptional abilities or heroic effort. The example of your life contributes to a larger cultural transmission of practical wisdom that helps each generation avoid having to rediscover basic survival strategies through trial and error. This cultural continuity reduces the risk and energy expenditure associated with learning essential life skills while preserving the flexibility needed for adaptation to new conditions. The environmental continuity that your life has both benefited from and contributed to represents one of the most remarkable achievements of natural systems. the ability to maintain stability and functionality across multiple generations while accommodating change at a pace that allows adaptation without requiring crisis management. This balance between continuity and change provides the foundation for all complex life, creating conditions where individual organisms can invest in long-term strategies while communities can evolve gradually in response to environmental challenges. If you could offer one piece of advice to the young kangaroos now navigating the challenges you once faced, it would be this. The secret to a satisfying life isn't avoiding boredom, but learning to find richness within routine, complexity within simplicity, and adventure within the boundaries of sustainable living. This advice emerges not from abstract philosophy, but from the accumulated experience of discovering what actually produces lasting satisfaction versus what provides temporary excitement, followed by disappointment or exhaustion. The capacity to find richness within routine develops gradually, as you learn to pay attention to the subtle variations and deeper patterns that exist within apparently repetitive activities. Each day's grazing expedition, while covering similar territory and involving similar activities, offers unique opportunities for observation, social interaction, and environmental learning that become apparent only when approached with genuine curiosity rather than automatic efficiency. The morning survey of your territory reveals different information depending on weather conditions, seasonal variations, and the activities of other creatures during the night. The quality of grass changes with soil moisture, temperature, and the stage of plant growth cycles. The social dynamics at water sources shift according to population changes, territorial negotiations, and the complex web of relationships that govern community life. Complexity within simplicity emerges when you understand that the basic activities of kangaroo life, eating, moving, resting, socializing, actually involve sophisticated skills and nuanced decision-making that can be continuously refined and improved throughout a lifetime. The selection of optimal grazing locations requires understanding of plant biology, soil conditions, weather patterns, and competitive pressures from other herbivores. Effective territorial management involves psychology, diplomacy, strategic thinking, and long-term planning. Adventure within sustainable boundaries means recognizing that the most satisfying challenges are often those that build on existing capabilities rather than requiring dramatic departures from proven strategies. The adventure of gradually improving your grazing efficiency, developing more sophisticated weather prediction skills, or refining your conflict resolution techniques provides ongoing opportunities for learning and growth without the risks associated with experimental approaches to basic survival requirements. Most of the dramatic stories they tell themselves about what their lives should include, the territorial conquests that will establish their dominance over large areas, the romantic adventures that will provide intense emotional experiences, the heroic survival challenges that will test their capabilities against extreme conditions, are actually distractions from the more important business of building a life that can be maintained over decades rather than experienced in intense bursts followed by exhaustion and recovery periods. These dramatic narratives often appeal to young kangaroos because they seem to offer faster routes to satisfaction and status than the gradual accumulation of competence and wisdom that actually produces lasting security and contentment. The pursuit of dramatic achievements often requires energy investments that prevent the development of sustainable practices, creating cycles of boom and bust that make long-term planning difficult and increase vulnerability to environmental challenges. The landscape that shaped your character and provided the context for your existence will continue to shape other lives long after your individual story has ended, demonstrating the kind of continuity that connects individual experience to larger patterns of meaning and value. The red rocks will keep their silent watch, the scrub brush will continue its patient survival strategies, and the seasonal cycles will maintain their reliable rhythms, providing the same opportunities for learning, growth, and satisfaction that supported your own development. Your contribution to this continuity was simply to live well within it, to take what you needed without depleting the resources that others would require, to pass on what you learned in forms that others could adapt to their own circumstances, to maintain and improve the territorial arrangements and social relationships that support community stability while allowing for individual variation and gradual evolution. This contribution, which might seem modest when measured against narratives that celebrate dramatic intervention and revolutionary change, actually represents the most sophisticated form of environmental and social responsibility. Living well within natural limits requires a deep understanding of those limits, not just their immediate practical implications, but their long-term significance for ecosystem health and community sustainability. It means learning to distinguish between needs and wants, between consumption that enhances life and consumption that merely provides temporary distraction from boredom or anxiety. Taking only what you need sounds simple until you begin to understand the complex calculations involved in determining actual need versus culturally constructed desire. Your gradual mastery of this distinction came through years of experimentation with different levels of resource consumption, observation of how various consumption patterns affected your energy levels, territorial security, and social relationships, and the slow development of confidence that enough really could be enough, if enough was carefully and thoughtfully defined. Passing on knowledge in forms that others could adapt required developing teaching methods that transmitted principles rather than rigid rules, context rather than predetermined solutions. You learned to share the reasoning behind your decisions rather than just the decisions themselves, to explain the observations that led to particular strategies rather than just prescribing the strategies, to help younger kangaroos develop their own capacity for environmental reading and social analysis rather than making them dependent on your specific conclusions. This approach to knowledge transmission proved more challenging than simply giving advice or demonstrating techniques, because it required understanding how learning actually happens through gradual integration of observation, experimentation, and reflection rather than through memorization of external instructions. But it also proved more valuable, because it produced genuinely competent practitioners rather than just followers who could mimic successful behaviors without understanding their underlying logic. The maintenance and improvement of territorial arrangements and social relationships represented perhaps your most complex ongoing responsibility, requiring constant attention to the balance between individual needs and community health, between stability and adaptability, between established precedent and innovative responses to new challenges. This work happened mostly through small daily decisions rather than dramatic interventions. Choosing to yield disputed territory when the cost of defense exceeded the benefit of possession, investing time in relationship maintenance even when more immediately profitable activities were available, supporting community members through difficult periods even when such support required personal sacrifice. Perhaps the most profound realization of your long life is that being ordinary, living a life that doesn't demand constant attention from others, doesn't create unnecessary drama that depletes community emotional resources, doesn't consume more resources than it contributes to overall system. Health is actually an achievement worth celebrating rather than a failure to achieve something more spectacular. This realization runs counter to cultural narratives that equate personal worth with exceptional achievement, individual distinction, or the ability to capture and hold public attention. In a world that often mistakes intensity for significance and novelty for progress, choosing to live sustainably and contentedly represents a form of quiet heroism that contributes more to overall well-being than many more dramatic but less sustainable approaches. The quiet heroism of ordinary life operates below the threshold of public recognition, creating the stable foundation that makes more visible achievements possible without requiring credit or acknowledgement for its essential contributions. This form of heroism involves the daily choice to prioritize long-term community health over short-term individual advantage, even when such choices involve immediate personal costs or missed opportunities for resource acquisition. It means resolving conflicts through patient negotiation rather than aggressive confrontation, even when negotiation requires more time and emotional energy than simply imposing your will through superior force or strategic positioning. It means finding satisfaction in gradual improvement rather than demanding immediate transformation, maintaining the patience necessary for sustainable change even when faster approaches seem available. It means learning to appreciate what exists rather than constantly seeking something different or better, developing the capacity for contentment that makes long-term happiness possible without requiring endless acquisition or achievement to maintain emotional equilibrium. This ordinary heroism requires its own forms of courage that are often unrecognized or undervalued by cultures that celebrate more dramatic expressions of bravery. The courage to resist social pressures that equate success with dramatic achievement, maintaining confidence in your own values and priorities even when others consider them insufficiently ambitious or exciting. The courage to find satisfaction in activities that others might consider boring, discovering richness and meaning in routine activities that don't provide obvious social status or external validation. The courage to prioritize sustainability over immediate gratification, making decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term emotional or practical benefits. The courage to accept that your individual life is part of larger patterns that extend far beyond your personal timeline, finding meaning in contribution to processes that you will never see completed rather than requiring personal witness to the full results of your efforts. The sun continues to rise and set. The grass continues to grow. The wind continues to blow. And somewhere in the red dirt of the Australian outback, young kangaroos are discovering that life's deepest satisfactions come not from extraordinary experiences, but from the patient accumulation of ordinary days, lived well, with attention and gratitude, and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from staying in one place long enough to really understand it. These discoveries happen gradually, through the same process of observation, experimentation, and gradual competence development that characterized your own learning throughout life. Each generation finds its own path to these insights, but the insights themselves remain consistent across time and circumstance. That satisfaction comes more from appreciation than acquisition, that security comes more from sustainable practices than dramatic achievements, that contentment comes more from understanding your place in larger patterns than from attempting to transcend or dominate those patterns. The consistency of these discoveries across generations suggests that they reflect fundamental truths about what actually produces human flourishing rather than cultural artifacts that vary with fashion or circumstance. The fact that each generation must discover them anew, through personal experience rather than inherited instruction, indicates that genuine wisdom cannot be transmitted through abstract teaching, but must be earned through the gradual integration of understanding and practice. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything that needs to be accomplished in a single lifetime. To live well within the conditions you're given, to contribute what you can to the continuation of life for future generations, to find satisfaction in ordinary activities performed with skill and attention, to leave the world in at least as good condition as you found it, and to demonstrate through your example that sustainable, satisfying life is possible for ordinary creatures willing to learn what actually works and apply it consistently over time. This modest goal encompasses more complexity and achievement than might initially appear. Living well within given conditions requires sophisticated understanding of those conditions, creative adaptation to their constraints and opportunities, and the development of skills and attitudes that can be maintained over decades without exhaustion or disillusionment. Contributing to the continuation of life for future generations involves not just biological reproduction, but cultural transmission, environmental stewardship, and the kind of social responsibility that creates conditions where others can thrive. Finding satisfaction in ordinary activities requires the development of appreciation, mindfulness, and the capacity for deep engagement that transforms routine tasks into sources of meaning and pleasure. Leaving the world in good condition requires understanding complex systems well enough to avoid unintended consequences while making improvements that enhance rather than degrade overall functionality. Perhaps most challenging of all, demonstrating through example that sustainable, satisfying life is possible requires the integration of all these elements into a coherent lifestyle that others can observe, understand, and adapt to their own circumstances, providing not a template to be copied exactly, but a proof of concept that encourages others to develop their own approaches to the same fundamental challenges of living well within natural and social limits.